Hey, so we're here talking about healthy relationships, kind of running concurrently with the series that we're doing here at Gateway Church. We're here with Carlos Ortiz and Libby Ortiz, our North Campus pastors, as well as part of our executive team here. And we are talking about communication today, which is such a vital thing when it comes to relationships, the way we talk to our coworkers, our spouses, our kids, families, friends, etc. And we know that so much of our communication that we operate in comes from our family of origins. So here's how I'd like to start us off. Carlos, if you can tell us, and then Libby, what are some of the things that you loved about your family and how you communicated, and give us a little bit of background. And then what are some things that you wish would have been different, that you maybe disliked about the way that you guys communicated?
Yeah, so first off, culture in our home was pretty loud. So my mom's Mexican, my dad's Puerto Rican, a lot of passion in the home. So I love the joy and the exuberance, and I'm a passion guy. So that was fun growing up in our home and around our communication. A lot of joking. And so that was good. We still have that. I'd say the part that was tough was as a kid who was really hurting in life, victim of sexual abuse, and just other things in my life. I felt like some of our conversations didn't really have a lot of substance outside of church, outside of like God things, but practical everyday life. And so it felt like even though we were passionate and we talked about a lot of things, it was kind of kept at a surface level. And for me, my parents were busy. They were pastors. They were pillars in our community. They had a nonprofit. They led thousands of people. I didn't want to burden them. So I kept a lot of that internal. So there wasn't a lot of like depth to some of our conversations growing up. So I wish we could have adjusted that as a kid.
Sure. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
How did that, when you did want to have a difficult conversation growing up, how did that play out in your household? Having two Latino parents who are also, like you said, pillars of faith in their community, what did that look like when you wanted to have a really tough conversation?
So I think looking back, obviously 2020, having that kind of vision, I think the lack of the depth of communication caused me to try to search out in other ways how to communicate what I was feeling and thinking. But again, being a victim of sexual abuse, and this is, 40 years ago or 30 years ago, I turned to drugs and alcohol as a way to pacify the need to communicate. I think when I was younger, I wouldn't have told you, well, I need to communicate what's going on. As an adult looking back, I was a kid who needed to use my words to express what I was feeling. But I didn't want to hurt my parents. I didn't want to share with them what all that happened as me being a victim. So I just kept it to myself and found other ways and other outlets to pacify it. And that's where I went down the road of addiction.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And Libby, would love to hear some of your background growing up, of your family. What were some things that you loved about the way that you guys spoke to each other, communicated in your home, and what are some of the challenges?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Midwest. My parents were blue-collar workers. The thing about my family is I grew up in a very toxic environment. So my dad was an alcoholic, and there were drugs involved. And so the environment, the atmosphere in my home was just very unhealthy, I guess you could say. And so the form of communication that I experienced was, in a sense, just very toxic. I guess that's how I would put it. So it was like the lack of probably communication as a child, like the I love yous, the I see you. So I think my mom would have done more of that if she wasn't so caught up in the relationship that she was in.
And holding it together.
Holding everything together. It caused her to be both the mom and the dad. And so she was playing both of those roles. So in a sense, I think for me, I kind of learned what I didn't want in a marriage or in a relationship. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew what I didn't want. I would say that the good thing, like something that came out of it is that we became closer.
Yeah.
As a family, I would say my siblings just kind of rallied and we kind of stuck together. So in a sense, yeah, it
like you guys
made
protected
our bond
each other
closer. Yeah.
So when you guys would have some tense things, Was your family more, let's avoid it, or let's battle it out?
Yeah. So my family was like, let's battle it out, and not holding anything back. So there were a lot of, words used, a lot of, we had to work through a lot of hurts, wounds, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing that. So you came from a family of battling it out. You came from a family of maybe covering it in prayer, just forgiving, stuffing, acting like it's not there. When you guys got together and you guys got married, early on in your marriage, how did communication, how did you maybe were you just passing ships or butting heads? What did that look like for you guys early on, and how did you work through it?
Yeah. Well, we share our story quite a bit here at Gateway, and sometimes we can overlook that part, the communication piece, because we talk about the dynamics of our family. But actually, communication was the very big miss that almost cost us our marriage early on. So we were 6 or 7 months in, and it was the first time I was reintroducing sex into my life. I became a Christian in college. I didn't sleep with anybody, which was like a miracle, for 5 years. I didn't really date anybody. So I meet Libby. It sounds great. We're going to go to the promised land of marriage. And after about 6 months in, we got pregnant really early. And all of the past hurts and sexual partners and pornography, all that stuff, like a tsunami in one day came back to my head. And I felt bad because I felt like I was cheating on you. But then my response to it wasn't very healthy. I didn't communicate what was happening in my heart or happening in my head. So I wasn't communicating anything and not realizing how she was receiving that lack of communication, which for you.
And so for me, since I grew up, feeling rejected, I felt rejected from my husband. So not only have I felt that from my dad, now I'm feeling it from my husband. And so it's causing me to kind of pull away. And it kind of brought a wedge between us.
Right. So here I was not communicating. But then when she did communicate, what were you saying?
Well, what was I saying?
I want to get divorced.
Oh, yeah. So it goes back to kind of how I grew up, right? And the things that I picked up on. So when things were threatened, the D word, right, was spoken, the divorce. Yeah. And so that's all I knew. So that was natural to me, right? So I felt threatened. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess the answer is to just get a divorce.
So then the cycle continues. I hear divorce. I'd never heard the word divorce in my home. So now I'm thinking, what in the world? No, we can't get divorced. Now I'm feeling shame. So then now we're spiraling.
Yeah. And so, that's cyclical. Yeah.
It's cyclical. Now we went from no communication around it, but my lack of communication caused her to assume things, which then caused her to communicate out of hurt, which caused me to communicate out of shame. And we just spun.
It's like a domino effect.
For 3 years. And we needed some major help to rebuild a brand new marriage.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you said you weren't communicating some of those hurts that came out of nowhere, was that out of kind of what you mentioned, not burdening her, like with your parents, or what did that come from a place of shame? Like, I can't share this with anybody.
It was both. One, it was, I'm like, dang it. It's been years and I'm still dealing with this. Like, I should be over this.
Yeah.
And those of us who've been through recovery, we know you don't ever get over something. You gain the tools to work through it.
To adjust.
And every time it gets smoother and smoother because you gain more tools and resources. The second thing was, here I'm married. We're really young. We're kids. We're pregnant. Everybody thinks we're these young pastors who have it all together, and I'm going to burden her. Look what she went through as a child, and now she married into somebody who's got all these issues. So it was actually both of those things. And I didn't give her the opportunity to share in my burden. So my lack of communication told her, I'm going to take care of it on my own. But that wasn't my heart.
And so then, Libby, it sounds like you went into self-protection mode, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've got to look out for me because nobody else is looking out.
Exactly. And so I did just that. I was self-protecting because here this man that I thought loved me was pushing me away. And the thing is I'm a very, I feel like I'm a very grace-filled person, right? So here I am just like, just tell me.
Yeah.
You know, I'm here. I want to help you. And finally you did that. And I think that's when we kind of started having our breakthrough.
We hit rock bottom at that point.
Yeah.
Because I communicated it. Took her still another week or two to process it. And then once we hit rock bottom, we knew, okay, we could probably save this and build something.
Yeah. I think you guys mentioned something really important. And this is at a big scale, right? Like 3 years, you know, that's big. But it's how do we communicate past the things that either burden us or trigger us? So for those listening who maybe that their issue isn't this long trauma in the moment, but their issue is every time she says this or he says this, it just, my temper goes up, I see red. How can we help people see past the triggers? What are some tools that you guys use in your marriage of either words you don't say or something happens with the kids or within your marriage that all of a sudden you want to go to high volume or to triggering language? What tools do you use to resolve the issue and not just lash out and throw darts at one another? What are some of the practical things you do?
Yeah, there's a lot of great resources out there that help do this, but one thing that really helped us is actually probably saved our marriage. We were at a marriage event and it was an intensive, and we walked away with a tool that I thought was super corny and dumb.
They usually are.
But it saved our marriage. Yeah. And it was this no scripts. And for probably 2 or 3 years after that, we gave each other permission to stop the other as they were talking and say, I need you, no scripts. What that meant was, I hear what you're saying, but you've said this 1,000 times the same exact way. I need you to find other words so that I can truly hear you. Initially, it sucked because I'm like, you're interrupting me. Yeah, but you're saying it the same way over and we're not resolving it. Can you, no script, re-say it? And then you hated it. Right? I mean, you hated when I'd interrupt you and you'd roll your eyes. But by doing that, it gave grace to the other person. You may not be meaning to say this. So can you rephrase it so I can truly hear you? And so that was probably a tool that really helped us. We don't use that anymore. We find other ways of doing that. Like you'll say to me, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Asking like clarifying questions.
Yeah.
And I think another way is I think when, you know, we all have triggers and stuff that haunt us from our past, I guess you could say. And I think something that's worked for me, not all the time, but something that's worked for me is to kind of like take a step back and kind of understand, why is this triggering me?
That's good. Yeah.
Where is this coming from? Is there a root?
Yeah.
And more times than not, there probably is a root.
Right.
And it's coming from something in your past. And realizing that and asking clarifying questions. Like, what did you mean by this? I'm hearing this, but what did you mean by this?
That's so good. That's so good. Because I think, especially if, you know, we're missing each other in the day, like we're not seeing each other in the day. In this case, married couple, or even if you're dating somebody, and the day's events can get to you. And then all of a sudden he says something that just triggers some of the pressure you're feeling, and it's a big blow up. And then you're feeling, where did this come from? Right?
Yeah.
But I think having what I'm hearing from you guys, it's eyes and ears of compassion of saying, hey, is there something else that happened today?
Yeah.
Is there something else that's gone on? How can we talk about that? Because we might see the minor thing, but there's a big backstory to what's going on.
Absolutely.
As parents, I'd love to get your take on this. What kind of communication do you build into your family? Knowing that you come from different backgrounds, what are some communication rules that you have in your family? Like one of ours might be, hey, we will never walk away when we're having an argument or a discussion. We'll never walk away and go out and turn our backs on the other person. And that goes for our kids too. But what are some of the ones that you have in your family?
So a big one for us is it's a value that helps with communication, which is time spent together. So as crazy as life can be, we have dinner together 3 or 4 times a week. And the rules around that is we rarely have guests at our dinner table, because we know that having 5 kids and a lot going on, that's the time you can talk about anything. And there are things brought up at our dinner table that you should not talk about at dinner.
I love
You just
those.
really
Yeah.
shouldn't. But we were youth pastors for years, and we saw thousands of kids come through and thousands of parents come through. And we said, the key to raising healthy teenagers is keeping the lines of communication open.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to pay the price to have that communication open. The kids don't pay a price for that. We do. So we do what we're doing now. We sit next to each other and we hold hands and we take turns gripping each other. Like, don't say anything. Don't overreact.
Yeah.
And the things that come out are both hurtful,
Yeah.
beautiful, insightful. It's a lot of oversharing,
Yeah.
but it's a place for them to talk because that it comes from our past. It allows Libby's hurt around the toxic communication to be fixed proactively.
Yeah.
And for me, it allows to have a deeper level of conversation that I wish I had. So together, we just created this table. Now, friends do come over sometimes and have dinner with us, and but we model the same thing for them. We want to create in these teenagers who maybe don't have a mom and dad at home, this is what life can look like. And it's not perfect, and it's super messy.
Yeah. Super messy.
We have a lot of follow-up conversations about a lot of things, but the kids get to say it.
Yeah.
And I would say half of our dinners, there's a lot of arguments, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Somebody is speaking what they're going through, right? I don't necessarily like the phrase speaking their truth, because truth really should be transferable to any place you're in. But I would say speaking their peace.
Or their emotional truth.
Speaking their emotional
That's
truth. So that we can bring truth to the situation. And a lot of times the kids help each other see the situation correctly. So now we're teaching them to be great young adults and hopefully be better parents to our grandkids.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm almost hearing this. You guys, as parents, will take the burden of some of that hurt trigger. You'll accept that as the sacrifice for just having great relationship with your kids. So it reminds me of this quote I heard in college pertaining to ministry, but I think it's to life in general and relationships is if you're not close enough to get hurt, you're not close enough, right? So I think outside of marriage and raising kids, what would you say to those listening in a culture and a society that says, hey, we are going to cancel you for what you said that hurt me because that means you're toxic, you're full of red flags, and I don't want to deal with it. What I'm hearing you guys say is, no, part of relationships is dealing with those hard things, talking through those things. What can you say to somebody who maybe isn't raising a family or isn't married, but there's people in their lives that they want to reach, but they're having a hard time getting past those triggers? How can they better communicate with their loved ones, with their friends around them?
What would you say?
You go first.
I would say sometimes we have to take inventory of our relationships. And we have to walk in a lot of self-awareness, which is something we talk a lot about with our kids, self-awareness. And there are times we're trying to manufacture a relationship that really isn't the relationship we think it is. And so different levels of relationships require different levels of communication. And that's why sometimes we miss it as humans, the communication piece, because it takes work. I talked about over the weekend just about the intricacy of the tongue, right? So if you ask somebody a question, is the tongue a muscle or an organ? People then pick one side or the other. It's actually called a muscular organ. And it has 8 muscles to it. It's not this just thing in your mouth. And it has 5 functions. So if the tongue is that fascinating, that it's a muscular organ, and if it has 8 muscles that create 5 functions, and that's the root of our verbal communication, that's how intricate communication is. So for those of us who are struggling with communication, just know everybody can communicate. What is your avenue to communicate? And then what is the other person's avenue to receive communication? And the relationships that are closest to you, it's worth the time investing and investigating how it really works. So as a mom of 5, communication is just so different, right? And I think how we approach our family being so large is the same way we approach relationships with people in general. We have all these people at North who hear and talk very differently. And as pastors, we have to go from every conversation with that mindset. How are they receiving? How am I talking? And it's very tiring.
Yeah.
But it's worth our time
Yeah.
to figure that out.
So I'm hearing self-awareness in inventory, right? Libby, what are the things in the people that you do life with outside of your family that that really have worked for you in your communication, whether it's dealing with something difficult or encouraging somebody? What are some communication pieces that people listening could take away from? Something good that has worked for you?
Yeah, well, I think when we talk about communication, we think it's always talking, right? Like communication is something coming out of your mouth. Well, there's another side to communication, and that's listening. And so, and if it's important, and maybe more important, you know, the side of listening. And so I think we all could do better at listening better and maybe not talking as much.
That's good. Yeah. God gave you 2 ears.
Yeah. What is it? Slow to speak, quick to listen. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
You know, and so that's what I would say.
Being empathetic listeners, right?
Yeah.
Not listening to respond or react,
Right.
but listening to hear what the other.
And I'll say something that Libby does really good at that I don't do well at. And that is we forget that there's a thing called written communication. And I think we overlook our phones because that's texting.
Yeah.
But texting is a great way to ping your friend, your partner, your roommate, your parents on something you're thinking without having to dive into an hour conversation. So Libby will just sometimes say, FYI, today is not a good day. I am so glad when I get those texts because now I know how to present myself when I come home.
That's money. Yeah.
Right? So we forget, like Libby said, there's multiple forms of communication that tell you how a day is going. So, you know, there's right now, there's social scientists are saying there's 5 ways to communicate now. Well, they each say there's only 4. And the 5th one is what you share on social media is a form of communication. It's not verbal. It's not written, right? It's not listening. It's not body language. But when you get a meme from a friend, it tells you the state of mind they're in. So it's a form of communication.
Yeah, that's good.
So if my wife sends me a meme that's funny about a mom, she's probably in a joking mood. She's communicating.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so much of our communication comes from these 2 stubby little thumbs, right?
So true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And it's almost even easier to talk to people, or people find it easier to talk through the device than it is some of these interpersonal relationships.
And I got to tell you, I struggled with that.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm right here. Talk to me. And what would you say to that?
Well, I just felt like, I feel like I can express myself better if I write it down.
Take the time to write
it's
it
not
down.
necessarily that it's through the phone. It's just an easy way for me to communicate my feelings or, you know, something I want to communicate to him.
So as I became a better listener, I was like, instead of rejecting and hating the text or the message, I learned to accept it as a form of her communication.
I think this is, as we wrap this up, I think those are great nuggets for a 2022 audience on just even how we can use our devices for good. Because we hear so much about how they're ruining communication, but these are some great ways that they can show up in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for being with us.
Yeah, it's great.
And we look forward to some of the future episodes of this podcast and helping our people grow in their relationships. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.